For 2 years he let her cry. Every night the sound came through the north wing of his house, and every night Corvin Viseri told his people the same thing: she is crying again. Let her cry. He believed his contract wife wept from a broken pride, nothing more. Then on the coldest night of the year, the crying stopped. When he finally went looking for the silence himself, what he found on that frozen floor did not just shame him, it made him set fire to his own blood. The house called Hallowmere kept its silences the way other men kept their weapons, close-oiled and ready. Corvin Vasari had built it that way on purpose. Marble that gave back no footsteps, doors that closed without a sound. Staff who learned in their first week that the head of the Vasari family did not care to hear the machinery of his own comfort. He wanted stillness. And stillness was the one thing money could buy cleanly, without blood on the receipt. It was near midnight, and he stood at the tall window of his study, with a glass of something dark and untouched in his hand, watching frost climb the glass from the outside in. Below him, the grounds ran white to the tree line. Past the trees, the city glittered like a spill of broken glass. The city he owned in the ways that mattered: the harbor, the freight, the men who moved things through both. In 2 nights, the Ostrov family would sit at his table and sign their names beside his, and the last stretch of independent water on the northern coast would fold quietly into his. His aunt called it a marriage of houses. Corvin called it an acquisition and did not pretend otherwise. A knock. 2 soft strikes. Precise. Only one person in the house knocked like that. Vespera Vasari came in without waiting, as she always did, a woman of 60, who wore her age like tailoring. She had run Hallowmere since before Corvin was old enough to run anything, and she moved through it as though the walls answered to her first, and to him second, perhaps once they had. The Ostrov people confirmed for Thursday, she said. Milos brings his sons. I have moved the wife to the north rooms for the week so she will not trouble the arrangements. Corvin did not turn from the window. Somewhere far off in the house, thin and high, the crying had started again. It reached him the way it always did, threadbare, muffled by walls and distance, a sound with a smaller sound folded inside it, a few tinny notes that rose and fell and rose again. 2 years ago, he had asked what the notes were. A music box, they told him, an old one, the only thing the Vance girl had carried into the marriage. He had not asked again. She is crying again, Vespera said, with the mild distaste of a woman noting a draft. Shall I have someone see to it? No, Corvin said. Let her cry. The words left him without weight, worn smooth by repetition. He had said them 100 times. He believed them, the way a man believes. The time on a clock, he has never once checked against the sun. Sullen Vance had come to him 2 winters ago as a line at the bottom of a ledger, a debt her dead father had left unpaid and unpayable, and Corvin had settled it the cleanest way the old rules allowed. He married the daughter, cancelled the number, and filed her somewhere in the house, the way one files a document that has served its purpose but cannot yet be destroyed. She appeared when the family required a wife to appear. Otherwise, she was a rumor at the end of a corridor, a closed door, a sound after dark. He did not love her. He had never claimed to. On the single occasion she had tried to speak with him alone, some months into the arrangement, he had been walking to a car, and he had told her, not unkindly, that the terms of their marriage did not include conversation. She had not asked again. They were, in that, well-matched. Tonight, though, something in the sound was wrong. Corvin found himself listening, which he never did. The crying was there, and the small melody was there, but underneath both ran a third thing, a ragged catch, a scraping intake of breath that did not sound like grief at all. It sounded like a person trying very hard to be quiet about something that hurt. He set the glass down. You look tired, Vespera said too quickly. It is nothing. Dr. Amsel saw her only this week. Nerves, he says. The girl was always fragile, come away from the window. You have Thursday to think of. Corvin looked at his aunt, then truly looked, and for the length of one breath, a thin thread of unease moved through him that he could not name. Amsel had used the same word, fragile, in his last 3 reports, each one shorter than the one before it. Corvin had signed them without reading past the first line. He wondered, suddenly, and for no reason he could defend, when he had last actually seen his wife's face. Then the crying stopped, not softened, not settled into sleep, stopped mid-sound, the way a wire stops when it is cut. The little melody wound down a few notes and died. Vespera was already talking about the seating for Thursday. No one in the house moved toward the north wing. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. Corvin stood in the sudden silence of his perfect house and felt for the first time in 2 years that he had left something unattended in a room whose location he could no longer quite remember. Morning came gray and hard, and by the time the light reached the study, Corvin had already been working for hours. Emrys stood across the desk from him, the only man in the house Corvin trusted at his back, without first counting the exits. Emrys had been with him 11 years. He was broad and quiet and missing the top of one ear, and he had never once told Corvin a comfortable lie. The Ostrov advancemen walked the grounds this morning, Emrys said. Counted our people. Counted them twice. Let them count, Corvin said. I do not like the arithmetic they are doing, Emrys said. A man who is buying into a house does not count the guns of the house he is joining. A man who means to take it does. Corvin signed the page in front of him and said nothing. He had circled the same thought for a week and set it aside each time, because the deal was good, and because Vespera had spent 2 months assuring him the Ostrov family came as partners and not as wolves. His aunt had never steered him wrong on matters of the house. He saw no reason to begin doubting her at the door of the largest arrangement of his life. It was Emrys who put the folded paper on the desk. I was asked to make certain this did not reach you, Emrys said, by your aunt. I decided that request was above her station and beneath mine. Corvin unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and entirely unfamiliar, which told him something in itself, that he did not know his own wife's hand. There were only a few lines. They said in the flat calm of a person who has learned that panic is never believed, that she needed 10 minutes of his time on a matter that touched his safety and not her comfort, that she would ask for nothing more, and that it could not pass through his aunt. It was dated 9 days ago. Corvin read it twice. The wife wrote this, Emrys said. There have been others. This is the only one I laid hands on. Something cold turned over in Corvin's chest, but the day was already in motion, and a man learns to mistake motion for direction. He told himself the note was a bid for attention, the oldest currency in a loveless house. He told himself his aunt had her reasons. He folded the paper into his pocket, meaning to think on it later, and it was in that exact moment, crossing the East Hall toward the cars, that he saw her. Solène Vance stood at the far end of the corridor in the gray light, wrapped in a coat too heavy for indoors, speaking to no one. She was thinner than the picture of her he had carried without knowing he carried it. Her skin had the color of paper held up to a window. When she lifted a hand to steady herself against the wall, he saw that it shook, a fine and constant tremor, and that she pressed it flat to the plaster at once, as though the wall might tell someone. Their eyes met across the length of the hall. She did not plead. She did not come toward him. She only looked at him for one long moment with an expression he would spend the rest of his life trying to unsee. The look of a person doing sums and arriving, every time, at the same empty answer. Then a door opened between them, and Vespera was there with her hand light on Selène's arm, turning her gently away, murmuring about the cold, about rest, about not troubling the master of the house on such a day. And Corvin, who had ended men for less than the thing crawling up his spine, told himself it was nothing. Let her cry, he thought. The way he always did. The thought did not steady him the way it used to. He got into the car. He would remember that, afterward, longer than he would remember almost anything else, that he had looked straight at the truth in a gray hallway and driven away from it to go and sign a contract. The signing was still a day off when Corvin came back to Hallowmere after dark, and the note was still in his pocket, and it had grown heavier with every hour. Vespera met him in the entrance hall the way she always did, with news already arranged to fit the shape she wanted his thinking to take. "I did not wish to trouble you before the signing," she said, "but you should hear it from me before you hear it from Milas. The wife has been seen at the North Gate twice this month, speaking with one of the Ostrov drivers. I am sure it is nothing. She is lonely, she is foolish, but the timing is poor, and if Ostrov decides your wife is approaching his men, he may decide you are the one doing the approaching. I have kept it quiet. I ask only that you leave the north rooms to me until Thursday is finished." It was cleanly done. Kervin had built a life out of noticing when a thing was cleanly done. She had handed him a reason to stay away, wrapped inside a reason to be grateful, and painted the wife as a liability in the same breath, so that anything at all he might find in the North Wing would already be waiting to be read as guilt. 2 years ago he would have thanked her and gone to bed. But the note sat in his pocket, in a hand he had not known belonged to his wife, dated before any of this began, and it did not read like the note of a woman selling him to wolves. It read like the note of a woman standing inside a burning house, trying to tell the owner where the fire was. "I will leave the north rooms to you," Corvin said. Vespera smiled, and the smile was the last thing that felt certain to him for a long while. He went to bed. He did not sleep. And at some hour past 2, when the house had gone as still as he had ever built it to be, Corvin Vasari rose in the dark and did the one thing his aunt had asked of him. He broke it. He had not walked the North Wing in years. Crossing into it, he was no longer certain he had ever walked it at all. The change came at a single door, as though the house kept 2 separate climates. On his side, the air was warm and smelled of wax and wood smoke and money. On the far side, the cold reached through his shirt on the first breath. The heat did not come here. Someone had decided the heat did not need to come here. The good carpet ended and bare boards began. The pictures thinned and then stopped altogether. A radiator he passed was stone cold beneath his palm and had been cold a long time, judging by the dust sealed into the valve. This was his house. He had signed the accounts that warmed it. Somewhere in those accounts, he understood now, ran a line where the warmth was permitted to stop, and he had signed that too, without once asking where the line fell or who was left to live on the far side of it. He passed a narrow room with its door standing ajar, and he stopped. It was where she had been kept. He understood that at once, and it told him everything the reports had been built to hide. There was a cot, not a bed. One thin blanket, folded with the terrible neatness of someone holding perfect order over the only square of the world still left to them. On a shelf sat a short row of things arranged with that same care: a comb, a chipped cup, a stack of papers weighted flat by a smooth gray stone. And it was cold, cold enough that his breath showed in the dark, in a house where he slept under a mountain of down and never felt the turning of the season at all. He crossed to the shelf. The papers were not letters to a lover, nor to a rival. They were notes, dozens of them in that same small, careful hand, and every one of them was about him. Dates, names, a driver seen where no driver had any business being. A shipment weight that did not match its own manifest, the word Ostrov, underlined a single time, and set beside it, in letters pressed so hard the pencil had almost torn the page. One more word, inside. She had not gone to the North Gate to betray him. She had gone to watch. Alone in the cold, with a stub of pencil, and not one soul who would listen, she had been building the exact case his own instincts had been circling for weeks, and she had tried to carry it to him, and his aunt had made certain the paper never arrived. Corvin stood in that freezing little room, with the proof of his own blindness in his hands, and from somewhere deeper in the wing, faint and thin, a few tinny notes of a music box began to play. They climbed and faltered and broke off on a sound he had spent 2 years refusing to hear. He was already moving before he knew that he had moved. He followed the sound the way a man follows a name he is not certain he heard. The north wing ran on longer than it had any right to. Corvin had known this house all his life and had believed, in the flat way a man believes the deed folded in his safe, that he knew its dimensions. He did not. The corridor bent and narrowed, and bent again, past doors that had not swung in a decade, past a window where the frost had grown across the inside of the glass in pale feathers. His own breath went ahead of him in clouds. He had stopped registering the cold as cold. It had become a fact about the place, like the dark, like the quiet. The longer he walked, the more the walk itself became the accusation. This was not a corner of the house forgotten for a night or a season. The neglect here had age to it. He passed a hard chair, set at an angle beneath a window, positioned, he understood, to catch the single hour in the afternoon when the sun would clear the eastern trees and lay a thin band of warmth across the floor. He passed a window frame where a strip of blanket had been torn away and pressed into the gap to stop a draft, the wool gone stiff and gray with time. Someone had lived in this cold long enough to learn its habits, to hunt its 1 hour of sun and plug its worst seams, and had done it on his money, under his roof, in a house he heated to the last inch of the wings he happened to walk. There was a small table set against the wall, at a turning, and on it a tray, and on the tray a bowl of something gone to a gray skin, untouched, left there, who knew how many hours before by someone who had carried it this far and no farther. Beside the tray stood a chair. Corvin looked at the chair for a long moment, and understood it, and wished he had not. Someone sat here. Someone had drawn this chair up within sound of the room ahead, close enough to hear, every night, what he had heard from a whole floor above, and had chosen the chair over the door. He could put names to the hands that would have carried that tray this far, and set it down and gone no closer. He had paid those hands for years. The house had not merely failed to come to her. The house had posted a listener at the very edge of her suffering, and called it, keeping an eye on the poor fragile wife. He kept moving. Once, months into the marriage, she had come toward him across a courtyard as he walked to a car, and he had told her the terms did not include conversation, and had watched her stop where she stood without argument, as though she had only been confirming a figure she already carried. He had thought her cold that day. He understood now that she had not been cold. She had been counting, the way she counted everything. And she had counted him and found the sum, and had never troubled him again, because the answer never changed. At the next door he found the thing that took the last of the doubt out of him. A shallow cupboard, its small lock forced at some point long ago and never mended, and inside, on the single shelf, a row of amber bottles standing in a neat line. He knew nothing of medicine, but he knew dates, and he knew his own supplier's mark pressed into a cap, and he knew that these had been filled month upon month in her name, on his account, and that not one of them had ever been opened. Bought with his money, carried this far, locked away in the cold where she could see them through a splintered door and never once reach them. Somebody had purchased her cure, and then made certain she would fail within sight of it. Corvin's hands were very steady. That was the detail he would keep afterward sharper than the rest, not shaking. Steady, the way they always went steady in the last moments before the worst things he had ever had to do. Ahead past one more door, the music box turned over its final few notes and stopped, and this time no crying came after it. Nothing came after it at all. The silence had a shape now, and the shape was wrong, and he crossed the last of the frozen floor toward it, not walking, not quite running, and laid his hand flat against the final door. The door was not locked. Somehow, that was worse. For a moment he could not make himself push it. He stood with his hand flat to the wood, and the cold coming through it into his palm. And he already knew, in the way he had known she was not dead and would soon know she was barely alive, that whatever lay on the far side was going to divide his life into the part before he opened it and the part after. He opened it. It gave under his palm and swung inward into a small hard room that had once been a washroom and was now barely anything. A sink, a window painted shut, one wooden chair. The bulb had burned out or been taken. The only light came gray off the snow, beyond the frosted glass, and it lay across the floorboards like something spilled and left there. The room told its story in the order he took it in. The chair had been dragged from its corner and set beneath the little house telephone on the wall, and he understood at once why. Because a person too weak to stand for long would have climbed onto that chair to reach the telephone, and would have found what he now saw, that the telephone held no handset in its cradle. Only the bare metal fork where a handset should have been. Someone had taken it. Not tonight. The dust had settled evenly across the empty cradle. His eye went next to the bell. The old servant's bell pull beside the door hung severed, its cord cut clean and high, well above the reach of any hand that might have caught at it while falling. And low on the doorframe, at the height of a person who could no longer rise from the floor, 4 short lines had been dragged down through the old paint, the marks of fingernails, of someone trying to climb a door to reach a latch that was never going to open in time. He read it whole, then the whole sentence of the room, and it was the coldest thing he had ever read. She had known the telephone was dead because she had climbed to it before. She had known the bell was cut. And still, at the very last, with her heart failing beneath her and no voice left to call with, she had crawled to that door and dragged her fingers down it, not because she believed it would open, but because a body keeps trying to live long after the mind has finished the arithmetic and found no answer in it. She had spent the last of her strength knocking at a door she already knew no one would open, and on the other side of that door, 1 floor above her, he had stood at a warm window with a glass in his hand and told his house to let her cry. He looked at the little window then, and saw that it too had been dealt with. It was not merely stuck in its frame. It had been painted over at the sash and sealed along every edge, with the patience of a decision, so that not even a person desperate for one clean breath of the winter air could have forced it up. Nothing in this room had happened by accident. Every small mercy it might once have offered had been found in advance and quietly closed. The music box lay on its side near the wall, its little brass drum still faintly turning, letting go one thin note, then another, into the room, with long dead spaces between them. Near it, a tin cup lay overturned in a fan of water, already skinning to ice at its edges, and beyond the cup, where the gray light thinned into the dark, beneath the sink lay the shape he had crossed his whole silent house to reach. Corvin made a sound he did not recognize as having come from himself. He crossed the little room in 2 strides and went down onto the freezing boards beside her and gathered her out of the dark under the sink and turned her at last into the gray light and looked, 2 years too late, at his wife's face. She was not dead. He knew it before any proof. The way a man knows the temperature of a room the instant he steps into it, from some animal register that sits below all thought. But she was close, closer to the edge than anyone he had ever hauled back from it, and he had hauled back a few in his time. Her skin was cold and gray, and her lips had gone the color of an old bruise. There was no wound on her. That was the thing his eyes kept hunting for and failing to find. A cut, a strike, some enemy's mark he could name and repay. There was nothing. No one had knocked her down. She had simply been left, night upon night, in the cold, without the medicine locked in a cupboard 40 feet away, until the body she had been quietly rationing at last called in everything it was owed. The crying he had listened to for 2 years and filed away under weakness had never been weakness at all. It had been a woman fighting for her own life in the dark, by herself, losing the fight 1 inch at a time, and taking care even then to keep the sound of it small, so that the house he ruled would not judge her a burden and be rid of her. Let her cry. He had said it 100 times. He heard himself say it now in memory, in his own flat and comfortable voice, and he understood for the first time precisely what the words had meant. Every night, at a warm window, with a full glass in his hand, he had given the same quiet order. He had told his house to let her fade, and his house had obeyed him to the letter. Her eyelids moved. It took everything she had left. He could see the cost of it cross her face. But they lifted, and her eyes found him, and did not quite dare to believe him. Her mouth shaped a word with no breath behind it to carry the sound. He bent his ear down to her lips. "Thursday," she breathed. "Not you. Do not sign. Even now. Even here." With the ice creeping across the spilled water and her heart stumbling under his hand, she was spending what might have been the last air in her body to finish the warning his aunt had spent 9 days making certain never reached him. She had crawled toward a dead telephone with a takeover in her chest in place of a prayer. Something in Corvin Vasari, a load-bearing thing he had raised in himself very young and shored up a little more with every year since, came down all at once and made no sound at all as it fell. He worked his arms beneath her and lifted her off the floor. There was so little of her left that for one sickening instant his hands mistook her for the blanket, and that, more than the cold, more than the cut bell or the locked cure, put a low and level roar into his ears. This had been done to her, slowly, on purpose. It takes time to reduce a person to so little one withheld meal, and one stolen degree of warmth at a time, and every hour of that long patient work he had passed, a single floor above, fed and warm and calling the silence beneath him peace. She did not fight him. She had nothing left to fight with. Her head came to rest against his chest, and her breath arrived in small uneven pulls. He could feel through the cloth of his shirt, and he began, without deciding to count them, because for as long as he was counting them, there was always another one still to come. He stood in the wrecked little room at the frozen end of his own house, holding her, and let his eyes move once more across the severed bell, the stripped telephone, the neat locked row of everything that might have kept her whole. Then he turned and carried her out. He did not go quietly. The doors he passed, he shouldered open, and left swinging on their hinges. The lights he found he switched on, and left burning. 2 years he had kept this house as silent as a held breath, and he was finished keeping it silent. Somewhere ahead of him, awake at this hour, still certain the arithmetic of the night belonged to her, his aunt was waiting to be told how it had all gone. She was going to be told. The far side of the house had never felt obscene to him before that night. He carried her back across the threshold where the two climates met, out of the cold and into the warmth he had taken for granted every hour of his life, and the ease of it, the sudden generous heat, turned his stomach. He had walked through that doorway 10,000 times, and never once felt the border under his feet. She had lived on the wrong side of it for 2 years. He did not take her to a guest room. He took her to his own, the warmest in the house, and set her down in the center of a bed, built for a man twice her size. And for the first time she looked small, in a way that had nothing to do with hunger, only with how much room the world had refused her. "Emery's," he said, and Emery's was already in the doorway. "Not Amsel," Corvin told him. "Amsel does not come near her. No one from this house comes near her. There is a doctor named Sorrel who owes me nothing and fears me correctly. Wake him. Bring him through the kitchen so the house does not see. And from this minute, 2 men on this door, and if my aunt sends anyone to ask after my wife, they learn nothing, and they come to me." Demrys looked at the woman on the bed, and something moved in his blunt face that Corvin had not seen there in 11 years. "She has been trying to reach you for months," Emery said quietly. "I should have carried more than the one note." Then he was gone. Corvin was left alone with her in the warm dark, and for the first time since the frozen room, he made himself look at her without the emergency of the moment to hide behind. In the lamplight, he could count the 2 years in her face, in the hollows, beneath her cheekbones, in the way the small bones of her wrist stood up under the skin, like something built rather than born. He had signed the food into this house. He had signed the heat, and the doctors, and every comfort under its roof. He had signed every single thing she had been quietly denied, and he had never once asked to see the person the signatures were being spent on. He sat with that because there was no one left in the room to hand it to. Sorrel came within the hour, gray and silent, and asking no question he was not paid to ask. He listened to her chest for a long time, with his eyes closed. He put the medicine that had sat locked in a cold cupboard at last into her arm, and slowly, a little color came back into her, the gray retreating from her lips like a tide going out. Her heart, Sorrel said. It has been failing her a long while, and someone has been helping it along. Cold, hunger, and she has not had this in weeks, though the bottles are dated to the day. He held up the amber vial. Whoever kept this from her knew exactly what it would do. A week more, and I would be signing a paper instead of filling a syringe. Corvin said nothing. There was nothing in him to say it with. It was near dawn when she surfaced. Her eyes opened, found the unfamiliar ceiling, the warmth, and then him, sitting where he had not moved from, and she flinched. Not from fear of him, he understood, but from the arithmetic starting up again behind her eyes, the sums of a woman working out what a change in her circumstances. You did not sign, she said. It was the first thing. Not, where am I? Not what happened. You did not sign. The signing is tonight, he said. Tell me why I should not. She told it the way she did everything, flatly, in order, without a single word spent on her own suffering. Ostrov did not come as a partner. Ostrov came to swallow the Vasery house whole, the harbor first, the men second, and Corvin himself last of all, because a family does not truly own a thing until the last man who remembers owning it is gone. The signing was not an alliance, it was the lid coming down, and the hand that had opened the house to Ostrov, that had drawn every plan and walked every step, did not belong to a stranger. It is your aunt, she said. It has always been your aunt. He had known it since the cold cupboard. Hearing it aloud was another thing entirely. And there is more, she said. And here, for the first time, her flat voice thinned. Years ago, before Corvin's time at the head of the family, a man had kept the Vasery books, an honest man in a dishonest house, and he had found a number that did not belong, a slow theft running out to a bank that would one day answer to the name Ostrov. He had taken it to the family, believing honesty was a kind of armor. 3 weeks later he was dead, and the story told was debt, and shame, and a weak heart that had given out under the weight of both. That man was my father, Selena said. The debt that bought me for your house was written over his body. I did not marry you to be saved, Corvin. I married in to find out who killed him, and I found her. And then I found she was doing it again, to you, and I could not prove it in any way a soul would believe, because who believes the fragile wife, weeping, at the end of the hall? So I watched, and I wrote it down. And I hid the one thing that ends her where no one would ever think to look. She closed her eyes. Ask me the rest tonight, she said. I am so tired, but do not sign. Promise me you will not sign, he promised. It was the easiest promise he had ever made, and the first in years. He meant with the whole of himself. He let her sleep, and he went to find the doctor who had helped to kill her. He walked the East Range slowly, and the slowness was deliberate, because a man who arrives at a decision too quickly can be talked back out of it, and Corvin did not want to be talked out of this one. He wanted to feel every step of the corridor. His money had kept warm while a woman froze at the far end of it. By the time he reached the door, the cold thing in his chest had set completely, and he was grateful for it. Dr. Amsel kept rooms close to the family, a comfort he had enjoyed for 9 years on the strength of being useful and asking nothing. Corvin woke him without a word, simply by being in the chair beside the bed when the man's eyes opened, and he watched understanding arrive on Ansel's face in stages. First, the confusion, Then the recognition. Then the exact moment the doctor's gaze went to the door, found Emrys filling it, and knew there would be no arguing at all. "I want to hear you say it," Corvin said. "Once, in your own words, so that I never have to wonder later whether I imagined it. Then you will never speak in this house again." Amsel was not brave. Few men who poison by paperwork are. The whole appeal of the method is that it never once asks you to watch. But he talked. He talked about Vespera, about the reports she had told him to write. Fragile. Nerves. Nothing that needs treating. Each one shorter than the last, so that no one would trouble to read past the first line. He talked about the prescriptions he had filled month after month and handed to Vespera instead of to his patient, and about the money that came back for it, always the money. And he talked at the very end about the thing he had told himself in order to sleep, that the wife was going to die anyway, that a weak heart is a weak heart, that he had only helped an ending find its way. Sads. She was going to die anyway, Corvin repeated, and the flatness of it made Amsel stop talking. Every person in this house is going to die anyway. I could help your ending find its way tonight, on that same reasoning, and sleep like a child afterward. He stood. You swore an oath to a stranger's health before you ever met my aunt. She kept her oath to a house that gave her a cold room and a locked cupboard, and she kept it better than you kept yours to anyone alive. Amsel began, at the last, to beg. He offered names, dates, everything he knew, as though information could buy back an oath. Corvin took the names, because he was not a sentimental man, and the names were useful, and then he did not stay to hear the rest of it. Emrys took the doctor out through the kitchen the way Sorrel had been brought in, quietly past a house that went on sleeping, and one of the two men who had been paid to let Selena Vance die was simply, cleanly gone before the sun had finished coming up. He went back to her. She had not woken. Sorrel had fallen asleep in the corner chair with his bag open on the floor, the posture of a man who had decided to stay whether he was asked to or not. The medicine had done its slow work, and her breathing, when Corvin bent low to listen, had lost the ragged catch that had run beneath it for 2 years. The very sound he had stood at a warm window and told 100 people to ignore. He listened to the smoothness of it for a long time, the way a man listens to rain after a long drought. On the table by the bed sat the music box, carried up with her out of the cold. He turned it over in his hands. It was old and cheap and lovingly kept. The small dents in the brass worn smooth by years of handling, the kind of thing a father buys a daughter for no reason at all, except that he loves her, and she is small and the world is not. Corvin owned a house full of objects worth more than most men's lives, and he could not recall the last time he had held a thing that had been loved rather than acquired. He wound it a few careful turns only, and set it down, and let the thin tune play once through in the warm room. The first time in 2 years it had sounded in that house as anything but the herald of a woman crying. Selene stirred at the sound, not toward waking, only enough to turn her face a fraction toward it, and something in the set of her shoulders let go. Corvin sat with the tune and did his own arithmetic for the first time in his life, honestly, all of it, and did not like a single figure in the sum. By the time Sorrel woke and Emrys came back, he had made up his mind, and the cold that arrived with the decision was the oldest and most familiar thing he owned. There were faster ways, and he weighed each of them and set it down. He could go to Vespera's rooms this morning and end it in a single sentence, and not a soul in the family would ask him a question, because he was the head of it, and she had betrayed him. And blood forgives blood almost anything except that. But a fast ending would let her burn her paper first, and weep her innocence after, and it would leave Ostrov loose in the city, to go and buy another aunt in another house inside a year. And there was a colder truth underneath the practical one, which was that if he killed her in the dark, in private, with no one alive to witness what she truly was, then some cowardly part of him would always be able to go on telling himself she had been the woman she raised him to believe in, right up until the end. He did not want the private version. He wanted the whole room to see her exactly the way he had seen the locked cupboard. They wanted a signing. They would have their signing. Every chair, every witness, every last drop of the theater they had built to swallow him. And in the middle of it, before the Ostrov family and every soul his aunt had spent 2 years teaching to look away, he would open the one thing she did not know his wife had kept and let the whole room watch her house come down around her. "Bring me the men I can trust," Corvin said. "Only those. Today we let the wolves come to the table." He looked once more at the sleeping woman and the silent box. "Then we close it on their hands." Vespera rose early. She always had. He had, perhaps, 3 hours before she found the doctor's rooms empty and began to wonder, and he did not intend to waste a single one of them. The house woke to a master it did not recognize. By full light, Corvin had done a thing he had not done in years, which was to walk his own house, slowly and truly, look at the people in it. He had spent 2 years moving through these corridors like weather, present and unregarded, seeing the staff the way a man sees furniture he has long since stopped noticing he owns. Now he saw them. He knew, from the chair and the untouched tray, that some of them had carried food to a cold door and turned back from it. He did not yet know which, and the not knowing changed the way he looked at every one of them. So he trusted. No face he had not already trusted with his life, and there were fewer of those than a man in his position should ever have to admit Emrys. First and without a question, 2 brothers named Cord, who had guarded his father before him. Too plain and too loyal for Vespera to have bothered corrupting, men who had never once risen high enough to be worth the price of buying. A handful more, gathered one at a time, quietly, in the gun room and the stable, and the cold end of the kitchen, each told only as much as he needed to be told. He assembled them like the one hand of cards a man means to stake everything on, without ever letting the table catch him, looking at it. Emrys found him in the gun room, near the end of it, and stood a moment in the doorway before he spoke. 11 years, Emrys said. In 11 years, you have asked me for a great many hard things, and I have never once asked you a question back. And I am not going to start tonight, but I want you to hear one thing from me first. I carried her note to you 2 months ago, and you did not read it, and I told myself that was your business and not mine, and I have not slept right since. Whatever you are about to do to this house, I am glad it is finally being done." Corvin looked at the one man in the building. He had never had a single cause to doubt, and did not thank him because they were not men who thanked each other, and only said, "Then stand where she tells you to stand tonight, and watch the one who runs, not the one who fights." Emrys nodded once, and for both of them it was enough. And everywhere he walked he saw the border, now, the line he had never once felt beneath his own feet, the place in every corridor past which the warmth stopped being spent and the watching quietly began. He passed a maid who would not meet his eye, and understood that she had sat in the chair at least once, and told herself that staying close to the door was its own kind of kindness. He passed a steward who met his eye far too easily, and understood the very same thing about him from the opposite direction. He said nothing to either of them. Let Vespera keep her house of listeners one more day. After tonight there would be no house left, standing for them to listen in. He had built this, he understood, as surely as she had. She had drawn the plans, but he had signed them year after year, without reading, and a house learns very quickly what its master will and will not trouble himself to see. He had taught every soul under this roof, without once saying it aloud, that a sound from the cold end of the hall was a sound that carried no consequence. Tonight, he would begin the far longer work of teaching them the opposite. When he came back to the warm room, she was awake, sitting up against the pillows, and the sight of her upright after the shape she had made on that frozen floor did something to his chest that he chose not to examine too closely. "You are planning something," she said. "I can always tell. You go very still. The way the whole house goes still, just before you do." "I am going to end her," Corvin said. "Tonight, at the table." in front of Ostrov and every man he brings with him. He sat on the edge of the mattress. But the notes from your room are not enough on their own. They damn her to me. They do not damn her to Ostrov, and they do not damn her to the other families, who will hear a wife's grudge and a husband's temper in them, and nothing more. A man is permitted to be cruel to his own household. That is the whole rotten grammar of our world. I need the thing you hid. The thing you said no one would ever think to look for. Selena looked at him a long moment, weighing, he understood, whether the man in front of her now was a man she could put her father's death into the hands of, and he sat under that look and let her take every second she needed of it, because she had earned every one and a great many more besides. Then she reached for the music box. My father did not buy this, she said, turning it slowly in her thin hands. He made it, in the years when he still believed a careful man could keep his family safe simply by being careful enough. He was good with his hands, and better with numbers, and he thought, I think, that if he built the box himself, he was building her something the world would never be able to get into. He used to wind it for me when I could not sleep, she said, and her thumb moved over the worn brass without her seeming to notice she was doing it. He would tell me that as long as the song was still playing, nothing in the house could come and reach me. I believed him for a very long time. I went on believing it, I think, even after I knew it was not true, because the thing your father tells you in the dark does not stop being a comfort simply because the world later proves it was a lie. She almost smiled. And a careful man builds a second bottom into the thing he gives his daughter. She pressed a seam his own fingers had crossed twice, without feeling anything at all, and the base gave with a small wooden sigh, and inside, flat against the works, lay a folded square of oilcloth. She lifted it out and held it across the warm quiet of the room. This small, terrible thing her father had died to write, and she had very nearly died to keep. Once you open it, there is no folding it away again and calling her your aunt over dinner. So, be certain, before you take it from my hand, that you would rather know the whole of it than keep the half you can still live beside. Corvin reached out and took it from her. He opened it on the coverlet between them, and the house he had been born into came apart in his hands, one page at a time. The first sheet was old, the paper gone soft as cloth with handling, the ink faded to the brown of dried blood, a single line of figures in a neat, dead hand, and beside one of them, circled once, a note in that same careful hand. This is not ours, 3 words. Corvin looked at the number, and at the bank it ran out to, a bank that had worn 3 different names in the years since, and wore the name Ostrov now, and understood that he was holding the exact moment, decades gone, when a careful and honest man had signed his own death warrant by refusing to look away from 3 words. Sulan's father had found the first loose thread of the thing that would one day swallow his daughter whole, and he had pulled it, the way honest men do, believing the truth was a wall he could stand safely behind, and it had killed him. And the house had called it debt, and shame, and a weak heart, and had gone on to dinner without missing a single course. The second thing in the oilcloth was newer, and smaller, and far worse. She had to show him how to work it. The little recorder wrapped in its own square of cloth, her fingers steadier on it than the rest of her had any right to be, and when it began to play, he wished, for one cowardly half of 1 second, that she had never kept it at all. It was Vespera's voice. He would have known it in a crowd of thousands, in the dark, at the bottom of a well. He had known it before he knew his own name. It was the voice that had woken him for school, and corrected his grip on a fork, and told him once in a black car in the rain that his mother and father were not coming home, and that he would have to be a man about it now because there was no one left for him to be a boy in front of. It had run this house through his childhood and his rise and every ordinary morning since, and now, out of a small machine on a warm bed, it was discussing his removal in precisely the tone it used to choose, the flowers for a table. After the signing, it said, to a man whose accent bent the same way the Ostrov sons did, when they thought no one was listening. Not before. Before and the families ask questions, and questions are expensive. After he is yours to lose, however you like, in whatever way looks most natural, and I will hold what is left standing, and the harbor is clean by spring. A pause, the small sound of a glass set down. He is not a hard man to manage. He stopped looking at anything in this house years ago. She had almost sounded proud of it. I saw to that. I saw to that. Corvin sat very still and let the recording run all the way to its end, and then sat on, in the ringing silence after it, and Selene, who had every reason on this earth to leave him alone inside it, did the one thing that undid him more completely than any page or any voice. She reached across the coverlet and took his hand, the same hand that had signed the accounts that froze her, and she held it, and she said nothing at all, and let him have the silence, without making him carry it alone. It was a long time before he could speak. She raised me, he said at last. It was not a defense. He did not know what it was. I know, Selene said. I am not going to stand here and tell you that it does not matter that she raised you, because it does matter, and pretending otherwise would be its own small cruelty, and you have had enough of those in 1 week to last a life. That is the very thing that makes this the worst I have ever had to put into another person's hands. She turned his hand over and pressed her thumb once to the center of his palm. But listen to me, because I have had 2 years in the cold to think it all the way through. She raised you into a man. She was certain she could point at a wall and trust never to turn his head. That certainty was the whole of her plan. It was the floor she built every other thing on top of. And this morning, in a freezing little room she never once dreamed you would walk into, you turned your head. So, she was wrong, tonight, about the single thing in all the world she was most sure of. Hold on to exactly that later, when she looks at you the way a mother looks, and tries to use the years against you like a key in a lock. Corvin turned her hand over in his, in turn. Her knuckles were still marked, 4 faint lines where fingernails had been dragged down an unyielding door. When this is finished, he said, and the words came out rougher than he had meant to let them, I am going to do a great many things I should have done 2 years ago, and you are going to find nearly all of them insufferable. I am going to heat every room in this house until the north wing runs like the middle of summer. I am going to take the contract that calls you a debt and burn it in front of you so you can watch the word itself go up. And I am never again, for as long as there's any breath left in me at all, going to let a single sound you make go unanswered under my own roof. She looked at him with the wary sums running look. He was learning to read. The expression of a woman checking a total that seemed too large to possibly be honest. You do not owe me any of that, she said. You owe me heat and my father's name set right. The rest of it is not a debt. I know, Corvin said. That is the first thing about any of it that I have ever wanted and not owed. For a moment she had no arithmetic ready for that at all, and the silence between them quietly changed its temperature, and neither of them said a word about it, because there was a house to save first. And they were both in their separate and stubborn ways, people who saved the house first. For 1 moment longer, he let himself sit in the changed quiet of it, because he had spent his whole life in rooms he was trying to win and could not remember ever once being in a room he simply did not want to leave. Then he set the feeling down, where he set every other thing he could not yet afford to hold, and she, watching him do it, seemed to understand the motion exactly, because she did the same with something of her own. Then she set the box gently aside and became in front of him the thing she had been in the dark for 2 years, with no one alive to witness it, the single sharpest mind under his roof. She laid the signing out for him move by move, and it was like watching a general who had been demoted to scrubbing floors finally handed back a map where Ostrov would sit, and why. At the center, with his back to the long black windows, because a man that's certain of winning always takes the chair that looks the most like a throne. Where Vespera would stand, at Corvin's right hand, close enough to lean in and steer, because she had stood there his entire life and would not be able to help herself. The exact moment the pen came across the table, which would be the one moment in the whole long evening when every eye in the room would be down on the paper and not up on the doors or the shadowed walls. She told him when to reach for the recording and when to say nothing at all and simply let the room do his work for him, because a threat spoken by a man is only an argument, while a threat spoken in the villain's own recorded voice is a verdict. She told him which of the Ostrov sons would reach for a weapon and which would reach for the exit, and to set Emrys on the second one and not the first, because a frightened man running for a door will get 3 people hurt getting to it, while a proud man who chooses to fight at least stands still while he does. And if it goes wrong, she said, and her flat voice did not change by a hair, if he is faster than we think, or one of the sons is braver than he looks, you do not stop for me. Emrys takes me out the side door, and you finish it without turning your head, because a man who stops to check on his wife in a room like that one is a dead man, and a dead man avenges no one. She said it the way she said everything, as a figure already carried out to the end. He did not agree to it. He also did not argue, because arguing would have told her he meant to break it, and he had decided he was finished lying to her, even by the shape of a silence. You have thought about this for a very long time, he said, when she had finally stopped. 2 years, she said, in the cold. It was the only warm thing I had. He looked at her a moment, this woman who had turned 2 years of a slow and patient cruelty into the sharpest plan of battle anyone had ever put into his hands, and understood that the house had been trying to break her the entire time, and had instead, without ever meaning to, been quietly sharpening her against its own cold stone. By nightfall it was set. The men he trusted were placed along the walls of the great hall in the deep shadows between the tall windows where the theater the wolves had written for the evening would never once think to look. Sorrel was installed in the small room beside the hall, with everything he might conceivably need for a woman whose heart could not survive another shock, because Solane was going to be in that hall no matter what Corvin said to her, in a chair, behind him. And he had given up the fiction that he had any right left at all to keep her out of her own reckoning. Yenrys himself carried the music box down the stairs and set it, closed and silent, at the head of the long table in plain and open sight, a plain, old brass thing that not one of the wolves coming to feed would trouble to look at twice. Then Corvin sent word out into the city that the master of the Vassery house was honored, and eager and looked forward with real warmth to welcoming the Ostrov family to his table at nightfall, to make at last, between their 2 great houses, a lasting and unbreakable arrangement. Every single word of it was true. He had merely declined to mention whose arrangement, in the end, it was going to turn out to be. Outside, the last of the daylight drained out of the sky, and across the city the wolves put on their good coats and came down to their cars, certain to the very last of them that they were the ones being invited to the meal. The Ostrov family came to Hallowmere at nightfall, the way buyers come to a property they have already decided to own, walking in without quite waiting to be shown. There were 9 of them at the long table in the great hall, Milos Ostrov at the center, with a son at each shoulder, exactly where Selena had said he would sit, his back to the tall black windows, in the seat that looked the most like a throne. And Vespera stood at Corvin's right hand, where she had stood at every table of his entire life, near enough to touch his sleeve. She was serene, and had every reason to be. As far as she knew, the one person who could unmake this evening was at that hour cold and finished at the far end of the house, exactly as she had arranged, and the tiresome business of grieving a wife could wait for tomorrow, once the harbor was clean and the ink dry. She did not once look at the plain brass box at the head of the table. Why on earth would she? She had heard it 1,000 nights through 1,000 walls, and had taught herself, like everyone under that roof, like Corvin himself, not to hear it at all. The talk was smooth and false and easy, and Corvin let all of it run. He played the part they had written for him without ever asking, the distracted air the softening man, the one who had stopped looking years ago, and let Milos Ostrov settle by slow degrees into the deep pleasure of a win that had cost him nothing. He poured the man's wine himself and asked after his sons by name, and watched the whole table relax around the certainty of him, and did not touch his own glass, and waited, exactly as his wife had told him to, for the single moment the room would have its eyes down on the paper. The papers came out. The terms were read aloud in a lawyer's flat drone, clause after clause, each one, a small door swinging quietly shut, the harbor, the freight, the men, the ports, the name itself. Corvin signed nothing, and smiled, and let the pen be made ready, and waited. The pen was slid across the polished table to him. He picked it up. And then, in the one silent moment when every eye in the great hall had followed the pen down to his hand and the paper beneath it, he set it down again, and reached instead for the plain brass box, and wound it. The thin little tune climbed up into the great hall, absurdly small and sweet beneath the heavy chandeliers, and every head at the table turned toward the sound of it, puzzled, and Vespera's turned with the rest, and Corvin was watching her face at the exact instant she understood, and he saw the color go out of it, the very same way it had gone out of Solene's, on a frozen floor. He opened the base of the box, and lifted out the recorder, and let her own voice pour out into the room full of the men she had sold him to after the signing, not before. He is yours to lose however you like, and I will hold what is left standing. Milos Ostrov came up out of his chair. Two of his sons put their hands inside their coats. But the room had heard it, all of it, every man Ostrov had brought along, to witness his easy triumph now, a witness, instead, to a woman calmly arranging a murder and naming her buyer out loud in front of 9 sworn mouths. And there is no gun anywhere on this earth quick enough to unfire a thing that a room full of your own enemies has already heard. And into the ringing, teetering silence, from the wide doorway behind Corvin, a voice he had come, against every term of every contract, to love, said very clearly and without a single tremor in it, "You should have made certain of me, Vespera. You never did have the patience for the details." Selene stood in the doorway on Emers's arm, upright, gray as ash, terrible, alive. Vespera stared at her as at a corpse risen out of the ground to read the charges against her aloud. "My father found your very first theft 20 years ago," Selene said, and she began to walk, one hand on Emery's, and one on the high backs of the chairs, slow and utterly unstoppable, until she stood level at last with the woman who had killed him. "You had him put in the ground as a debtor and a coward, and let the story do the rest of the work for you. I kept his page. It is lying on the table in front of your buyer, right now, in your own handwriting, beside his." She turned then to Milos Ostrov, still half risen, his hand frozen over the front of his coat. "She sold you a house she never owned," she said. "And in the last minute she has sold you a murder that you are going to be remembered for arranging. I would take the door, if I were a guest, in this house tonight, while the door is still a thing my husband is willing to offer you." Milos Ostrov was a hard man, but he was not a stupid one, and only a stupid man stays at a table where his own plan has just been played back to him in a dead woman's voice. Emery stood square in the one exit, exactly where Selene had set him, his eyes on the son who wanted to run and not on the ones who wanted to fight. Corvin's own men had come out of the shadows between the windows, where the theater had never once thought to check. For one long breath, the entire hall balanced on the edge of a knife, and every person in it knew it. Then Corvin spoke for the first time since he had set the pen down, and his voice had gone to the terrible quiet it always went to just before the worst things he had ever done. "You came into my house tonight to take my harbor and my life," he said, unhurried, almost gentle. "You are going to leave it with neither, and with your own arrangement recorded on a machine that stays in my keeping. And you are going to spend every year you have left being very careful. Because the first morning I hear the name Ostrov in my city again, is the morning that recording reaches every family and every court that would take pleasure in it. Your trucks are off. My water by first light. You, personally, are off it now. They went. It is an ugly thing to watch. 9 proud men decide all at once to choose living over winning, and Corvin watched every second of it without moving, and did not enjoy it, and did not need to. Only Vespera did not move. I raised you, she said into the emptying room. All of it, the house, the discipline, the name, and the man you were standing there being, that was me, every year of it. And you would throw your own blood out into the snow over a girl who walked in here with nothing to her name but a music box. You gave me a cold house, Corvin said. And you taught me, very patiently, over many years, not to hear it. He did not raise his voice even slightly. She gave me 2 years of her own life inside that cold, so that I would have a house left standing to be saved. That is the whole of the difference between the two of you. And it is the only difference that has ever mattered. You are not my blood tonight. If I am honest with myself, you have not been, for a very long time. You are only the last cold thing left in this house, that I still have to carry out of it. He did not kill her. Selene had asked him for that, quietly in the warm room that afternoon, and she had been very clear that it was not mercy. A clean end is quick, she had said, and it is quiet, and it is final. And Vespera has not earned a single one of those 3 things. So he did the far colder thing. He gave her to the other families whose money she had also touched across the greedy years, with the recording and her father's pages copied into a dozen waiting hands, and let her walk out of Hellemere stripped of its name and all its protection into the dangerous world she had spent her life making more dangerous, with nothing left to hold any of it off. The great door closed behind her, and the hall was suddenly enormous and silent and, for the first time in the memory of anyone standing in it, warm all the way to its corners. Corvin turned, and Selene was already folding the very last of her borrowed strength spent on the single act of standing level with her father's killer, and he crossed the length of that hall faster than he had ever crossed anything in his life, and caught her before the cold floor could have her a second time. She did not wake for 2 days. Sorrel did not leave her side through either of them, and Corvin did not leave the room, and for 2 full days the great house that had spent 2 years training itself not to hear one woman now held its breath over her instead, listening for every sound she made. Her heart, Sorrel told him, on the second night in the low voice men use over the very ill, had come nearer to stopping on that hall floor than he was willing to say aloud in the room. And the only reason on earth that it had not was that its owner was, in his long and considered professional opinion, the single most stubborn organism he had ever in his career been asked to keep alive. He said it almost with admiration. Corvin did not smile, but something behind his face eased by a fraction, and Sorrel saw it, and went back to his watching. On the first night she surfaced, once only for a moment, not to any true waking, and her hand moved across the blanket, searching the way it must have searched 1,000 nights in the dark for some small thing to hold on to. Corvin put the music box into it. Her fingers closed around the cool brass, and her face eased, and she went back down into the dark, still holding it, and he sat and watched her hold it, and did not move his chair a single inch until the morning came. When she finally opened her eyes, it was to warmth, and to clean gray morning light, and to a man sitting exactly where he had not moved from. And this time, she did not flinch at the sight of him, and she did not begin, behind her eyes, to count. She only looked at him for a long, quiet while, taking the measure of the room and the warmth, and the plain fact of being alive inside it. And then she said, "She is gone." And it was not a question. And he said, "She is gone." And something in her that had been clenched hard for 20 years, since a black day and a false story, and a father buried as a coward, quietly and finally came loose. He had not waited for her to wake to begin. By the time she was strong enough to cross to a window on Sorrel's arm and look out at the snow, the whole north wing was warm. He had opened it up wall to wall. He had torn the painted-shut window clean out of its frame with his own 2 hands and let the winter air move through the room like something allowed at last. He had driven heat into every cold, forgotten room where a person had once had to hunt the single traveling hour of afternoon sun. And the chair, the listener's chair, the one that had sat outside her door for 2 years while she fought for her life on the other side of it, that one he had broken apart himself and carried out into the yard and burned in the snow and stood over until there was nothing left of it but a black mark that the next snow would quietly cover. He had the north wing lit as well, every lamp in it, every night, whether a soul walked there or not, because a house that has spent 2 years keeping one end of itself dark can only be taught the other way by the sheer stubborn force of habit. And he meant to teach it. The maids who stayed on said the master had grown strange about light, that he would stop in a warm and empty corridor that no one used, and simply stand in it a moment, as if to be sure it was warm, before he went on his way. They were not wrong. He did check. He would go on checking, one corridor at a time, for years. The staff who had carried trays to that door and turned away from it were gone from the house inside the week, without violence, and without a written reference, which in his world was a sentence entirely of its own. Her father's name he could not hand back to the man himself, but the lie he could lift off it, and he did. The debt that had bought her into the house was struck out of every ledger that had ever carried it. And in the empty place where it had stood, in the family's own permanent records, in Corvin's own unhurried hand, he wrote down the truth, instead, that a man named Vance had died honest inside a dishonest house, that he had been killed for the single crime of keeping faithful books, far more than it could ever hope to repay, and had begun, very late and very ashamed, to try. He had a stone cut for the man as well, with his right name on it, and the word honest carved where the old marker had said debtor, and he did not tell Selene he had done it until it was already standing, because some gifts sit heavier on a person. It was a full week before he let himself say the thing he had been carrying since the moment he first knelt on that frozen floor. She was much stronger by then, sitting up against the pillows, wrapped in warmth, the music box mended and quiet on the table at her side, its second bottom empty now, and its long secret spent. "The contract that married us is ash," he told her. "I burned it myself in the study grate the morning after. You are not a debt, Selene, and you were never for one day a wife who agreed to be one. So you are free, entirely and truly free, and I want you to hear this next part exactly as I mean it, with nothing hidden underneath it. If you tell me to go, I will heat this house for you and staff it with people who would sooner die than let you cry alone in a single room of it, and I will never trouble you again for the rest of your life. You would want for nothing. And you would see me never." Selene studied him with the old wariness, the familiar sums running quietly behind her eyes. "And the other choice?" she said. "The other choice is me," Corvin said, and it was without any question the hardest sentence he had ever made himself speak, because there was no arithmetic anywhere inside it to hide behind, nothing to weigh or hedge or balance, only wanting. Badly, and for the whole rest of it, not a contract, and not a debt, and not a wife, filed away and forgotten at the far end of a cold hall, chosen, out loud, in the warm, with the whole house listening, if it cares to. I am asking you, Selene. It may honestly be the first thing in my entire life that I have ever actually asked for, instead of taken or bought, or simply signed." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over to the table and wound the little music box, and the thin sweet tune climbed once more up into the warm room, the very same notes that had run for 2 long years, underneath the sound of a woman crying, alone in the dark. And this time there was no crying anywhere beneath them at all. There was only the warmth, and the clean light, and the small brave sound of a loved thing playing, at last, in a house that had finally learned how to hear it. "That," she said softly, when the tune had wound down to its end, is the first time this house has ever heard that song and not called it weeping. Then answer me, he said. She reached out and took his hand, the way she had taken it on the coverlet, and turned it over in both of hers and pressed her open palm flat against it, the way you press a seal to a page, to make a thing true. Stay, she said, and heat the north wing. And do not, you ever, for as long as we both live, tell me again that a room somewhere needs less warmth than the rest of the house. Corvin Vasari had spent 2 years quietly teaching a great house not to hear one woman weep at the end of a hall. He would spend the whole rest of his life tearing that house down to its cold gray stone and raising, in its place, one that would never in all its days have to. The man who once said, "Let her cry," became the man who heard everything, every night, for the rest of his life. The Ostrov family never crossed his city line again, not once, not even to try. The sparrow vanished into the dangerous world she had spent a lifetime so carefully building, with nothing left in her hands to hold any of it off. And the quiet contract wife who had frozen in silence at the end of a forgotten hall, so that the husband who never looked at her would still have a house left to wake up in, became the one single voice under that whole vast roof that he would stop the entire turning world to answer. On the coldest nights of that first winter, the ones when the wind came in off the water and found every old seam in the stone, he would sometimes wake to the small sound of the music box playing softly in the dark beside him, wound a few turns by a hand that no longer had to do it alone. And he would lie still and listen to it all the way to the end, every single time. He had spent 2 years being able to sleep straight through that sound. He would never once be able to again, and he came to think of that out of everything the woman beside him had quietly handed back to him as the thing most worth the keeping. If a woman fighting for her life alone in the dark, and the hard, cold man who finally learns how to hear her, is the kind of story that keeps you warm on a night like this one, then please do not let it go cold on you now. Tap that like button. Subscribe for more grounded mafia love stories where the quietest one in the room turns out to be holding every last card, and share this with someone who needs the reminder tonight that the strongest person in any room is very often the one that nobody has ever bothered to listen to. And tell me, down in the comments, the exact moment you think Corvin should have turned his head and looked at her sooner. I promise you, I will be reading every single one. And I will see you very soon in the next story.